sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need to be fully transparent so that we can bring about the necessary understanding of what, in fact, took place, and so that we can secure the necessary justice that has been lacking, and that we can also correct the historical record, and that we can go forward in terms of pursuing justice and not having situations like occurred in the Canadian Parliament, where we inadvertently end up indulging the falsity of history.
That's former Liberal Justice Minister Irwin Cotler there, speaking with CTV's chief political correspondent Vashi Kapelos for this week's upcoming question period, which airs on Sunday, echoing calls to unseal a nearly 40-year-old report on known Nazis in Canada. It's called the Deschênes Report from back in 1986. Lists the names of about 240 alleged war criminals, Nazi war criminals, who may have been living in Canada. It's all part of a larger political firestorm that's dominated Parliament the whole week after former House Speaker Anthony Rota accidentally invited a Ukrainian-Canadian veteran to attend President Volodymyr Zelensky's address to Parliament. A veteran who served in a Nazi-affiliated unit during World War II. That veteran, Yaroslav Hunka, was from Rota's home riding in North Bay, Ontario. He was given a standing ovation by Parliament. The Speaker eventually resigned under extreme pressure. The House will elect a replacement coming up on Tuesday. But will that reset be enough to dampen all the damage? Let's bring back our front bench. Carleen Varayan joining us, Melanie Paradis, Guratan Singh, Rachel Aiello. And Mel, I'm going to start with you again on this one. A mess. We all know that. We all agree. How does the government find its way back?
Well, it's going to be a long slog still, in part because they did not respond quickly enough by taking action immediately when the story first broke. I think that they waited a bit too long before issuing apologies, and as a result, this has just dragged on, as you said, for an entire week in an already very busy news cycle, when there are things like Canada-India tensions to talk about and focus on. And instead, this has become the leading story of the day for the past week. I think that it speaks to a profound, obviously this was a profound mistake. I think it was likely a mistake by a very busy staff person who did not do a proper vetting. As a former speechwriter to the Office of the Leader of the Opposition when Aaron O'Toole was the leader, I personally picked up the phone and called some of the people who we included in speeches, because I needed to be certain that their stories were legitimate if we were talking about them, and that nothing was going to come back to haunt us. It's a lot of extra work for a staffer to take on, but clearly that did not happen in this case, and it has had massive implications for this government, including on the international stage. And now, as we know, this individual faces extradition.
Yeah, and Guratan, to you, following this throughout the week, covering it here on News Channel, I mean, the truth is stranger than fiction, as they say. But, seeing these headlines, former Nazi recognized and applauded by the Canadian Parliament was just unbelievable and staggering, mind-blowing for us in the media and people at home watching all this. The dust settling, sort of, but talk to me about the damage you think that's been done here.
It's been a tremendous amount of damage, both locally and nationally, I should say, and also on the world stage. And it's also damage that could have been mitigated. So this was a really terrible mistake that was made, particularly painful for the Jewish community. The issue is that instead of addressing it right away with an immediate resignation from the speaker and an immediate apology from the prime minister, they allowed the story to drag out and really give it oxygen when it should have been something that should have been just immediately and quickly responded to. Instead, it seemed like the Liberal government wanted to have the speaker, kind of thrown under the bus and take all the blame on the matter. And he was slow to his resignation, and the prime minister was slow to his apology. And to me, that just allowed this story to get even a larger and larger stage, and it's had greater impact on us and really has dominated the headlines, and has, at the same time, taken attention away from other really important matters like affordability, Indian-Canadian tension, the fact that a lot of Canadians are struggling right now to put food on their table. And so I expected a faster and a more direct apology from the government. They should have acted faster, and the result is that they're now wearing this issue in a far greater capacity.
Carleen Vrian, where was the Prime Minister on this? And as Garadan is saying, it seems as if he almost, didn't want to go there, so to speak, on whether the Speaker should resign, perhaps hoping it would blow over, didn't want to get involved. I'm not sure what was going on. But in your mind, was it a case of how not to handle a crisis?
Well, this event, this address by Zelensky to Parliament, it was supposed to be this moment to celebrate and acknowledge the sacrifices that the Ukrainian people have been making to fight for their democracy and their culture and these efforts toward peace. What happened is not only extremely horrific and hurtful, not just to the Jewish community, but also to Polish people, Roma, LGBTQ2 persons, people with disabilities, all of those who were targeted by the Nazi regime. But I don't think any politician, any leader ever wants to have to get into the game of having to say, well, this wasn't really my fault, or I didn't know about this. But if you really want to peel back the layers here and dive into a very quick civics lesson, I think the trouble that the Prime Minister had was that it happened to be true in this case. There is a very clear and distinct separation between Parliament, which governs itself, and the executive, the Prime Minister, cabinet, so on and so forth. So when the Prime Minister and the government say that they truly had no idea that this individual had been invited as a personal guest of the Speaker of the House of Commons, that is entirely true. So what I suspect happened behind the scenes was that the government was horrified when they learned what had happened, had absolutely no desire to in any way own that, such a terrible mistake. But what happened then was that things dragged on. The Speaker had his own reasons for taking the time that he did before he stepped away. And the consequences for the Prime Minister are that whether he likes it or not, he is the face of Canada that represents our country on the world stage. And so I do think that after a few days, when it was clear that this was dragging on for far too long, he did the right thing. He did the thing that a leader should do, which was step in front of a microphone and apologize on behalf of all of Parliament and Canada to all of those who were affected by this.
Rachel, you and I covered this extensively on Monday and then into Tuesday as it kept dragging, and you had said this is totally unprecedented, really, all the international headlines that were generated as well. And there was this sense that top ministers in the Trudeau government were coming out and saying the Speaker needs to go, he needs to go, leader of the opposition comes out, he needs to go, but nothing from Justin Trudeau before the actual resignation of Anthony Rota. Your read on how this was handled, let's say, from a PR campaign as you were following it as a reporter?
Yeah, I mean, Todd, I got into the office on Monday and thought Rota was going to be gone by the end of the day. That didn't happen. And then we saw the pressure ramp up, and I thought for sure the Prime Minister's apology would be coming in short order after Rota resigned. That didn't happen. And as our other panelists have outlined, this really did drag it on, I think, to the point of the Prime Minister trying to walk that fine line of what he was and wasn't responsible for. Well, he has stood in front of the House of Commons and apologized for things he absolutely had nothing to do with in the past. National official apologies for the purge, for example. So I'm not sure I quite buy the spin of him not wanting to specifically own this. I think he did try to make that clear that he was apologizing on behalf of Parliament. The other question here, Todd, about the communications, and as we saw in that interview that Vassy Kapelos did with the Governor General, is why the Prime Minister hasn't reached out to Zelensky directly, and now that that is something that Canada's Governor General is considering doing, is another kind of next step of this that I'm still kind of wondering about.
Yeah, and a lot of questions, I think, for Canadians right across the country, Mel, who are basically saying this kind of has a Keystone Cops amateur hour feel to it. How is it possible that this could have happened? Are there not checks and balances? Are people not vetted properly? How does somebody get in there and there's a standing ovation? And I mean, the whole thing just turned into a complete and utter fiasco on the part of how it was, first happened on the Friday, and then, of course, how it was handled in the 3, 4, 5 days after.
Oh, it's completely embarrassing. I think that the key lesson here needs to be that if you have to do a hard thing, whether that is apologize or fire someone or demote someone, whatever the case may be, you need to do it quickly. Do not hesitate. If you hesitate, it will always make things worse.
Yeah, and you're a former politician, Garadan, so they often say when you're explaining in politics, you're losing. So, there was an opportunity perhaps for the Prime Minister to come out on the Monday and say, look, you need to go, he needs to resign, we're going to take control of his situation. This was a complete disaster. We own it, and I'm taking leadership, instead of allowing ministers to come out before him and do that.
Totally. And like, folks are not wrong for, rightly so, describing the division of powers that exists in the House of Commons and the fact that the Speaker does have his or her own jurisdiction. But the problem is that Canadians, by and large, are probably not fully aware of that distinction, and it doesn't matter. This was an international shame on Canada. This is something that was news across the world. It directly had implications and hurt someone we're trying to help, the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, and also had dramatic and horrific pain here locally to the Jewish community, and all the other communities are impacted by the horrific Nazi regime. In this context, when you talk about like amateur hour, yeah, it does seem like there was an aspect of amateur hour that resulted in this occurring, but that continued after this crisis as well. And instead of acting decisively right away, it's like crisis comms 101. You want to, immediately address an issue on its nose, and you kind of take out any criticism to it. Instead, you had this almost internal conflict where you had cabinet ministers calling on the Speaker's resignation, silence from the Prime Minister, and it just it really demonstrated a lack of maturity in the government. It's a problem, and I think there just needs to be decisive actions anytime you have these kind of issues on the world stage.
Karleen, I can give you about 20 seconds. A lesson learned here?
I am inclined to agree with Melanie that when you have to do a difficult thing, those things are best done quickly. But the last thing I will say is that with issues like these, things are always far more complicated behind closed doors than we likely realize. And I suspect that includes the relationship between Canada and Ukraine's respective leaders. So I think we'll see more to come from this, but I hope that there is only healing to come from now on.
Karleen, Melanie, Garatin, and Rachel, good to see all of you. Appreciate this. Thank you.